Danny Morris heard the crash around midnight while working in his garage, and the sound echoed through the quiet hills like thunder tearing the sky apart, and he grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the woods behind his farmhouse, because living alone for 3 years had taught him that strange noises needed investigation and not imagination. The forest glowed with an eerie blue light that pulsed between the trees, and his boots crunched through fallen leaves as he moved closer to whatever had fallen from the sky. And when he pushed through the final barrier of branches, he saw her, and his breath caught in his throat because she was like nothing he had ever seen before. She stood nearly 7 feet tall with skin that shimmered silver in the moonlight, and her eyes were large and luminous like captured starlight, and she wore armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal across her body, and in her hands she clutched a device that sparked and smoked, and behind her lay a craft that had carved a burning trench through the earth. She stumbled forward and collapsed to her knees, and Danny ran to her without thinking, because injured meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant needing help regardless of where someone came from, and she looked up at him with those impossible eyes and tried to speak, but the sounds were like music and thunder mixed together and made no sense to his ears. He gestured toward his house, and she understood somehow, and leaned against him as they walked, and her weight was substantial, but he managed to guide her across the field and up his porch steps and into his living room, where she collapsed onto his couch, and her breathing came in rapid gasps. Danny brought water and bandages, even though he had no idea if either would help, and she drank the water carefully and watched him with an intensity that made him nervous. And then she touched the damaged device and it flickered to life, projecting images into the air above them. The first image showed a beautiful world with crystal cities and green oceans and beings like her, moving peacefully through streets and parks. And Danny understood this was her home. And then the image changed and showed massive dark ships descending from space and fire consuming everything, and her people falling and cities crumbling to dust. She touched the device again, and another image appeared showing more worlds and more destruction, and Danny counted 7 different planets all burning and all dying under the assault of an empire that moved like a plague across the galaxy. And then she showed him something that made his blood run cold. She showed him Earth, and she showed him the dark ships heading toward it, and the timeline display suggested they had maybe 6 months before the Empire arrived, and Danny felt his stomach twist because this was not just her problem anymore, and this was humanity's problem too. She pointed to herself and made a gesture that seemed to indicate movement or travel, and then she pointed to the device and shook her head, and Danny understood that she needed to go somewhere, but her ship was broken and she could not complete her mission, and the weight of that failure showed in every line of her face. Over the next 3 days, Danny learned to communicate with her through gestures and simple drawings, and the device slowly translated more words between them, and he learned her name was something like Kira, though the actual sound was more complex and beautiful than his tongue could manage, and she learned his name easily and said it with a softness that surprised him. Kira showed him what she needed to repair her ship, and Danny recognized some of the elements from his mechanic work, but others were completely foreign, and then she showed him an image of crystalline rocks that glowed with inner light, and Danny felt a shock of recognition because he knew where those existed. The old Holloway mine 20 miles north had been abandoned for 40 years, but Danny remembered his grandfather talking about the strange glowing stones they had found in the deepest shafts and how geologists had never been able to explain them, and now he understood they were not from Earth at all. They left before dawn in his truck with Kira crouched in the back under a tarp, because he could not explain her to anyone who might see them, and the drive took 2 hours on rough roads that wound through increasingly remote territory, and when they arrived, the mine entrance yawned like a dark mouth in the hillside. Kira moved with fluid grace despite her size, and Danny followed her into the darkness, with only his flashlight and her glowing eyes to guide them in the mine tunnels, stretched deep into the earth, and the air grew cold and stale as they descended, and after an hour of walking they found the chamber his grandfather had described. The walls sparkled with embedded crystals that pulsed with soft blue light, and Kira made a sound of relief and began carefully extracting the stones with tools from her armor, and Danny helped by holding containers and providing light, and they worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of their efforts. Then the drones found them, and the attack came without warning, and the first blast took out a section of tunnel behind them, and cut off their escape route, and Kira moved with incredible speed and pushed Danny behind a rock formation before returning fire with a weapon that appeared from her armor. The drones were small and fast and deadly, and they filled the chamber with weapons fire that carved chunks from the stone walls, and Danny realized these were hunting Kira and had probably tracked her signal from space, and he felt anger rise because she was trying to save his world and these machines wanted to stop her. He noticed the drones all emerged from one tunnel, and he remembered his grandfather's stories about the mine's layout, and he grabbed a support beam that looked ancient and unstable, and he told Kira to fall back, and she understood and provided covering fire while he worked. Danny used a rock to hammer at the beam's base, and the wood cracked and groaned and finally gave way, and the tunnel ceiling collapsed in a cascade of stone and timber and buried the drone entrance, and the remaining drones in the chamber became confused without their guiding signal, and Kira destroyed them quickly. They gathered the crystals in silence and made their way back through alternate tunnels that Danny barely remembered from childhood explorations. And when they emerged into daylight, both were covered in dust and blood and exhausted, but they had what they needed back at his farmhouse. Kira worked on her ship with an intensity that bordered on desperation, and Danny helped where he could and learned more about her technology in 3 days than humanity had discovered in centuries, and he saw how the crystals powered systems that bent space and generated energy from seemingly nothing on the 5th night while they worked under the stars. Kira suddenly stopped and looked at him, and she spoke through the now functional translator, and her voice was beautiful and sad, and she told him she was the last of her kind scout fleet, and all the others had been destroyed trying to warn the galaxy about the Empire. She told him her mission was to reach the Galactic Council and present evidence of the Empire's crimes and rally the surviving civilizations to stand together, because alone they would all fall, but united they might survive, and Earth's only hope was if she succeeded, because humanity was not ready to face what was coming. Danny asked why she cared about Earth when her own world was gone, and she touched his face with surprising gentleness and said that every world mattered and every species deserved the chance to survive, and she had seen too much death to accept more without fighting the next morning. They heard helicopters in the distance, and Danny knew the government had finally tracked the unusual activity. And Kira's ship was nearly ready, but not quite finished, and they had perhaps an hour before the helicopters arrived and found everything. Danny told her to go and to take the evidence to the council, and let humanity face its future with whatever time her warning could buy them. And Kira refused and said she would not leave him to face punishment for helping her. And Danny laughed and said that humans were stubborn enough to handle their own governments. She made the final repairs with speed born of necessity, and her ship hummed to life with a sound that made Danny's teeth ache. And before she boarded, she pressed a small device into his hand and showed him how to access the data she had compiled and told him to spread it however he could. Then she did something unexpected and pressed her forehead against his. And suddenly he felt everything. She felt and saw fragments of her memories and understood the depth of her loneliness and her determination and her hope that maybe this time would be different, and the connection broke and left him breathless. Kira boarded her ship, and the craft rose silently into the air and hovered for a moment as if saying goodbye. And then it accelerated upward so fast it seemed to simply vanish and left only a thunder crack in its wake. And Danny stood watching the sky. Long after she disappeared, the helicopters arrived 20 minutes later and found Danny sitting on his porch with a laptop and a story that no one would believe. And he showed them the scorch marks and the data and the evidence that something extraordinary had happened. And they took him away for questioning that lasted 3 days. But Danny had already uploaded Kira's data to a dozen scientific networks and hidden backup copies in places no one would think to look. And within a week, researchers around the world were analyzing the information and beginning to understand what was coming, and some believed and some did not. But the seed was planted 2 months later. Danny was back in his farmhouse trying to rebuild his normal life when his laptop